Hello, dear listener. Make yourself a cup of tea, settle into your favorite chair, and come with me to the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, where nothing is ever quite as peaceful as it seems. I'm told the kettle's just boiled. Perfect. You are about to hear a brand new adventure starring that gentle terror of wrongdoers, Miss Jane Marple. Chapter 1, The Postmistress's Last Delivery. St. Mary Mead lay under a low October sky the color of pewter. The war was 7 years gone, yet the village still wore its ration book face. Patched elbows, darned stockings, and smiles that cost nothing. The horse chestnuts along the high street had begun to surrender their leaves in slow, golden snowfall, and every gust carried the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. At 6:20 on a Tuesday morning that smelled of frost, Ernie Hogg the milkman pushed open the post office door with his shoulder. 2 crates of milk balanced against his hip. The little bell gave its usual apologetic ting. No answer. "Morning, Mrs. Stubbs. Pint on the step, same as always." Silence. Ernie stepped inside. The post office was a narrow cave of pigeonholes and brass and the faint sweetness of sealing wax. Gas lamp still burning. Gladys Stubbs was a great one for economy, but she would never leave the lamp alight when she locked up. Ernie set the crates down. "Mrs. Stubbs?" He saw her boots first. Sturdy brown lace-ups, always polished on Sunday, now sticking out from behind the sorting table like a child hiding badly at a party. Gladys Stubbs was lying face down across the table, one arm flung forward as though she had been reaching for something just out of grasp. Her gray hair had come unpinned and lay across the green baize like spilled wool. A single red rose, dark as arterial blood, was pinned to the collar of her navy cardigan with a tiny pearl brooch that had belonged to her mother. Ernie's knees went loose. The milk bottles clinked together. "Mrs. Stubbs." "Gladys?" He touched her cheek. Cold, quite cold. On the table beneath her outstretched hand lay a half-written picture postcard, a colored view of Bournemouth Pier. The message, in Gladys's neat Board of Trade copperplate, read, "They know about the letters. Tonight the rose will tell. Burn this." The ink was still wet. Ernie stumbled backward, caught the doorframe, and began to shout for help in a voice that did not sound like his own. By 7 o'clock, the high street had become a stage. Constable Polk arrived on his bicycle, helmet under one arm, mustache a quiver. Dr. Haydock followed in his Austin 10, scarf flapping like a surrender flag. Doors opened, curtains twitched, and the village held its breath behind net curtains the color of weak tea. Inside the post office, Dr. Haydock knelt beside the body. He was a spare man with kind eyes and a permanent stoop from listening to too many chests. "Dead 6 to 8 hours," he said quietly. "No marks of violence, heart simply stopped. Poor old girl." Polk scratched his head with the wrong end of his pencil. "But the postcard, doctor, and that rose. Funny business." "Funny is not the same as foul play, Constable. Mrs. Stubbs was 71, valvular disease. I warned her last spring." Miss Jane Marple arrived at 10 minutes past 7, pension book in hand, umbrella furled like a guardsman's rifle. She wore a dove-gray coat that had been good in 1938 and a velvet toque hat pinned at an angle that suggested she knew exactly what she was about. She paused on the threshold, taking in the scene with eyes the color of washed-out blue china, eyes that noticed everything and forgave most things. "May I come in, Constable? Only my pension." Polk stepped aside automatically. One did for Miss Marple. She moved forward with the small, deliberate steps of the elderly who have learned that hurrying is undignified and usually unnecessary. She looked at Gladys, at the rose, at the postcard. Then she looked at the floor. A single petal, bruised crimson, lay just beneath the lowest pigeonhole. Miss Marple bent. She was surprisingly supple for her age, and picked it up between kid-gloved fingers. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. Miss Marple, really, my dear doctor, she said mildly. When Mrs. Emery had her stroke in the lending library, you pronounced heart failure within the hour. Yet 6 months later, the coroner found digitalis poisoning. One must keep an open mind. Haydock flushed. That was different. Mrs. Emery's nephew was a chemist. Quite, said Miss Marple. She studied the rose. It was perfect. A hybrid tea called Crimson Glory, still dewed as though freshly cut. The stem had been thrust through the buttonhole of Gladys's cardigan with some force. A bead of greenish sap glistened at the puncture. From whose garden, I wonder, she murmured. Paulk shifted his feet. Only one person grows roses like that in the village, miss. Miss Lavinia Gray up at the Red House. Actress, or was. Moved here last year. Miss Marple nodded as though she had known it all along. By 8 o'clock, the post office was locked and sealed with a handwritten notice, closed owing to bereavement. The village gathered at the Blue Boar. Conversation bubbled like soup on a Primus stove. Heart attack, Dr. Haydock says. Funny time for a heart attack, 11:30 at night. Who pinned that rose on her? Gladys always locked up at 6 sharp. Postcard about letters, whatever did she mean? Miss Marple sat in her usual corner by the fire, knitting something lavender and complicated. She listened more than she spoke, which was her custom. Old Mr. Petherick, the solicitor, came in mopping his forehead, though the morning was cold. Terrible business. Gladys handled the post for my late brother's estate. Confidential, some of it. Across the room, Colonel Bantry blustered to anyone who would listen. Damned woman, opened my letters for 20 years, knew I was in Queer Street, told the bank manager I shouldn't wonder. Young Ruth Price, the district nurse, sat pale and quiet at the bar, twisting her engagement ring. Her fiancé, Tom Bragg, the postman, stood behind her, pouring half-pints he did not taste. Miss Marple's needles clicked. At 9 o'clock, Miss Marple walked slowly home past the post office. The seal was already in place, but the side window, the one that looked onto the back garden, was unlatched. Village policemen were thorough about front doors and careless about windows. She had noticed this phenomenon since 1916. She did not enter. She simply stood among the Michaelmas daisies and studied the ground. The flower bed beneath the window had been disturbed, earth scuffed, a clear footprint, small, narrow, a woman's court shoe, heel mark deep where someone had knelt, and caught on the rambling rector rose that grew against the wall, a scrap of pale blue wool, the exact shade of the cardigan Gladys had worn yesterday when she served Miss Marple with 2 shillings and 6pence worth of stamps. Miss Marple unpinned the wool with care and tucked it into her handbag beside the bruised petal. Back in her own neat sitting room, she laid her finds on the little mahogany table. One crimson petalone strand of pale blue wool, the memory of a footprint, and the postcard, which Constable Paulk had allowed her to photograph with her Kodak brownie before he locked it away as evidence. She made herself a cup of camp coffee and sat down to think. Gladys Stubbs had been a fixture in St. Mary Mead since 1919. Widow of a railway clerk, childless, respectable, feared. Because Gladys knew everything. Who was in debt? Who wrote love letters to persons not their spouse? Who received remittances from unmarried sisters in Australia under plain cover? In a village, knowledge is currency. Gladys had traded in it for 33 years. Miss Marple sipped her coffee. Someone had decided the price had become too high. She opened her notebook, the small Morocco-bound one she had used since the affair of the vicarage goldfish, and wrote in her fine, slanting hand, Rose, Lavinia Gray's Crimson Glory. Footprint, small, high heel, LG wears court shoes even in garden wool. Gladys's cardigan, snagged after death. Postcard written in haste, ink still wet at 6:15 a.m. Therefore, Gladys died between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. Rose pinned postmortem. Stiff fingers could not have done it. Murder. She underlined the last word 3 times. Outside, the church clock struck the quarter. Somewhere a blackbird sang as though the world were still innocent. Miss Marple closed the notebook and looked toward the window. Across the green, she could see the red house, where Lavinia Gray was even now cutting more roses. Dark, perfect, deadly. "My dear Gladys," Miss Marple said softly to the empty room, "you always said one day your tongue would be the death of you. It seems you were right." She reached for her knitting again. The lavender thing was beginning to look suspiciously like a baby's booty. Someone in the village was expecting, and secrets like roses have a way of blooming at the most inconvenient times. Chapter 2. Tea at the Vicarage. The vicarage drawing room smelled of beeswax, chrysanthemums, and the particular brand of anxiety that only a fresh murder can produce in an English village. It was Wednesday, 29 hours after Gladys Stubbs had been found with a crimson rose pinned to her cold heart. The inquest had been opened and adjourned, the post office remained sealed, and the collective nerves of St. Mary Mead were frayed to the consistency of overboiled wool. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, had done what any sensible woman would do under the circumstances. She had issued 23 invitations to tea, written in her looping Italian hand on decal-edged cards. "Informal," she had told her husband, "just to stop people talking nonsense in the post office queue." The vicar, who had never succeeded in stopping anyone talking anything in his life, merely sighed and went to look for his sermon notes on the prodigal son. By 3:30, the room was full to bursting. Miss Marple arrived precisely at 25 minutes past the hour, early enough to be polite, late enough to observe who was already seated where. She wore her second-best coat, mulberry wool with a small tear under the left arm that only she knew about, and carried a sponge bag containing ostensibly her knitting. In reality, it also held the scrap of pale blue wool, the bruised petal, and a tiny tin of Andrew's liver salts, because excitement always gave her wind. Mrs. Clement swooped upon her like a flustered hen. "Miss Marple, thank heavens! Do sit by the fire, your usual chair, I've kept it." The usual chair was a faded tapestry affair with one spring that threatened the unwary. From it one could see every face in the room and, more importantly, every hand. Miss Marple settled herself, arranged her skirt, and began to count. 5 principal suspects, as she had privately labeled them, were already present. Colonel Bantry, retired Indian Army, scarlet face, white mustache like a yard brush, was attacking a plate of anchovy sandwiches as though they had insulted his regiment. Miss Lavinia Gray, ex-West End leading lady, still beautiful at 40-something, ash-blonde hair swept up in a style that required 20 minutes and 14 Kirby grips every morning, reclined on the sofa in a cloud of Loher bleu and cigarette smoke. Ruth Price, District Nurse 26, pale, freckled, engaged to the postman, sat bolt upright on a spindle-legged chair, clutching her cup as though it were a life-belt. Mr. Percival Fortescue, London solicitor, thin as a heron, pince-nez glittering, stood by the mantelpiece explaining death duties to the vicar, who looked desperate. Mr. Ambrose Luce, church organist and choir master, small, neat, smelling faintly of incense and hair oil, hovered near the piano, arranging music as though someone might suddenly break into Jerusalem. Miss Marple's needles began their quiet conversation. Click, 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 click. Conversation, never languid in St. Mary Mead, now galloped. Colonel Bantry's voice boomed above the teacups. "Damned woman had no business poking into my affairs. Knew I was in debt up to the eyebrows. Told old Curtis at the bank I shouldn't wonder. If I'd been 20 years younger, I'd have wrung her neck myself." A collective intake of breath. Mrs. Clement spilled lapsang souchong into the saucer of the assistant district nurse. Miss Lavinia Gray gave her famous throaty laugh. Darling Colonel, we all threatened to murder Gladys at some point. She once told me my understudy was receiving my fan mail. I nearly throttled her with my mink stole. She extended one slender hand to take a cucumber sandwich. The hand was, Miss Marple noted, the left one. And on the fourth finger glittered a large emerald that exactly matched the flash of green sap she had seen on the rose stem yesterday. Ruth Price set her cup down with a clatter. I feel a little faint, she whispered. Her fiancé, Tom Bragg, the postman, instantly materialized at her elbow. He was a tall young man with honest brown eyes and shoulders that looked as though they had carried more than mail bags. Steady, love, he murmured. Ruth's hand clutched his sleeve. Miss Marple saw the knuckles whiten. Interesting. Mr. Fortescue cleared his throat like a man about to address the Old Bailey. Mrs. Stubbs was, in possession of certain documents relating to the late Mr. Edgar Stubbs's estate. My client, Mrs. Arabella Stubbs of Tunbridge Wells, Gladys's sister-in-law, has instructed me to recover them. Most urgent. Mrs. Clement looked bewildered. But Gladys had no family except... Precisely, said Mr. Fortescue, snapping his briefcase shut with a sound like a gunshot. Mr. Ambrose Luce drifted across the carpet as though on casters. He placed a small silver vase on the piano. Inside was a single crimson rose, identical to the one pinned to Gladys's cardigan. A tribute, he said softly. From my own modest bush. Poor Gladys admired them so. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Mr. Luce's bush was a hybrid tea called Ena Harkness, darker, almost black-red. Crimson Glory had a deeper scent and a longer stem. She would have sworn to it in court. Mrs. Clement, desperate to restore normality, began passing the cake stand. Victoria Sponge, coffee walnut, and, rather rashly, Mrs. Bantry's famous cherry cake, which required 3 attempts with the tin opener and still bore the dents. Miss Marple accepted a sliver of walnut. She used the tiny fork to dissect it while she listened. Colonel Bantry was now holding forth about blackmail. £40,000 I owe, 40, and that infernal woman knew it. Threatened to tell Dolly unless I paid her 50 quid a month. 50. On my pension. Dolly Bantry, who had just entered in a flurry of mink and indignation, heard the last sentence. Arthur Bantry, you promised me that Maltese casino business was finished in 1936. The colonel went the color of beetroot soup. Miss Lavinia Gray rose gracefully. Darlings, I must fly. Matinee nerves, you know. She had not trodden the boards in 8 years, but no one liked to mention it. As she passed the piano, she paused to inhale the rose Mr. Luce had placed there. Divine, she murmured. Ambrose, you are a magician. How do you make them so perfect? Mr. Luce flushed to the roots of his pomaded hair. Green fly oil, he said, and prayer. Miss Marple made a small note in her head. Green fly oil usually contained nicotine. Ruth Price slipped out to the cloakroom. Miss Marple followed at a discreet interval. The cloakroom was a narrow passage lined with walking sticks and smelling of damp macintoshes. Ruth stood before the mirror, powdering a face that needed no powder. She was crying without sound. My dear, Miss Marple said gently, a trouble shared is a trouble halved. My nephew Raymond says it is nonsense, but then he is a man. Ruth gave a watery smile. It's Tom, she whispered. Gladys had a letter from the hospital about the morphine. They think I took it. If Matron finds out, I'll lose my post and Tom will lose his, and we're saving for the deposit on Laburnum Cottage. She began to sob in earnest. Miss Marple produced a clean handkerchief scented with lavender water. There, dry your eyes. Gladys is beyond punishing anyone now, and letters have a habit of disappearing. Ruth looked at her with sudden hope. Do you think? I think, said Miss Marple, "that someone in this village is very anxious indeed that certain letters should disappear forever, and they are prepared to do more than steal to make sure of it." Back in the drawing room, the atmosphere had thickened like cooling custard. Mr. Fortescue was examining the rose vase through his pince-nez. "Curious," he said. "The stem has been pierced. See? Tiny hole just here." Colonel Bantry peered over his shoulder. "Looks like a hypodermic mark. Used to see 'em on racehorses in Poona." Miss Marple's heart gave a small, excited skip. At 10 minutes to 5, the sky darkened and rain began to lash the windows like thrown gravel. Mrs. Clement rang for fresh hot water. The maid, Clara, brought in a tray and dropped 3 spoons. Miss Marple noticed that Clara's left hand was bandaged. "Burn?" she asked sympathetically. "Rose thorns," Clara muttered. "Miss Gray's prize bush. Stripped it bare yesterday evening, she did. Said she needed them for a floral tribute." Miss Marple filed the information away. As the clock struck 5, Miss Lavinia Gray's voice floated in from the hall. She was telephoning, loudly because actresses telephone loudly even when they imagine themselves discreet. "Yes, darling, the Red House, St. Mary Mead, send the usual. And tell him I need the black and white negatives by Friday or the deal's off. Ciao!" She swept back in, trailing Chanel and Mystery. Miss Marple's needles clicked faster. The party broke up in a flurry of umbrellas and excuses. Miss Marple lingered to help Mrs. Clement stack cups. "Such a success," Mrs. Clement beamed. "No one mentioned murder above 6 times. Miss Marple smiled. "My dear, they mentioned nothing else, but they have told me a great deal." She gathered her sponge bag and stepped out into the rain. Under the dripping yew tree, she paused to empty her shoes of gravel, and in doing so, noticed something glinting in the mud. A tiny mother-of-pearl broochback, the sort that fastens a pearl pin to a cardigan. Gladys Stubbs had worn one exactly like it. Miss Marple slipped it into her bag beside the wool and the petal. 5 suspects, 5 motives as clear as the vicar's surplice, and 1 rose that had not yet finished telling its story. She opened her umbrella. Black, serviceable, bought in the January sales of 1934, and walked home through the rain, knitting needles ticking like a comfortable clock against the ribs of her bag. Chapter 3. The Matter of the Missing Letters. A thin, unnecessary mist hung over St. Mary Mead like a bad conscience. The post office remained sealed. Yellow tape across the door flapped in the wind with the mournful air of bunting at a funeral no one had wanted to attend. Miss Marple woke at 6, as was her habit, made tea strong enough to stand a spoon in, and sat at her little walnut bureau with the green leather top. She opened the Morocco notebook and added 3 fresh entries in violet ink. Rose stem pierced. Possible syringe mark, mother of pearl broochback found under vicarage, Clara's left hand thorn scratched. LG stripped entire bush Tuesday 6 to 8 p.m. She underlined the word entire twice. Then she dressed in her navy blue costume with the small white spot, the one she kept for inquests and christenings, and set out. Her first port of call was the police station, a red brick box that smelled of carbolic and despair. Constable Polk was eating a bacon sandwich and reading the racing page of the Daily Express. "Morning, miss. Come about your pension again?" "In a manner of speaking," said Miss Marple. She laid on his blotter the photograph she had taken of the postcard. "I wondered whether Inspector Slack had arrived from Much Benham." "Due at 10, said Polk gloomily. "Sent a telegram. Do nothing till I come." Typical. Miss Marple smiled, the small, spinsterish smile that had unlocked more doors than any skeleton key. "While we wait, perhaps you could show me the sorting table, just to set my mind at rest." Polk hesitated, then decided that an old lady could hardly contaminate evidence more than the milkman already had. He fetched the key. Inside the post office, the air was colder than yesterday, as though death had opened a window onto January. The sorting table still bore the faint outline of Gladys's body in floury dust. Miss Marple moved like a quiet moth. She noted the gas mantle had been turned low but not out. Gladys had expected to work late. The stamp drawer was open exactly 1.5 inches, the width of a man's thumb. On the floor beneath the letter scales lay a single flake of gold leaf no bigger than a sequin. She picked it up with stamp tongs and slipped it into a twist of tissue. Next, she examined the pigeonholes. Most were empty. The mail for the past 2 days sat in sealed sacks in the corner. But one compartment, labeled Undelivered Hold, contained 3 letters and a brown paper parcel addressed in violet ink to Miss L. Gray, the Red House. Miss Marple's lips pursed. The top letter was postmarked Tunbridge Wells, 18th of October. The handwriting was Mr. Percival Fortescue's, spiky, impatient, legal. She did not open it. She simply photographed it with her Kodak, using the miniature tripod she kept in her handbag for photographing flowers. At 9:20, she was seated in the snug of the Blue Boar with Sir Henry Clithering, late of Scotland Yard, who had arrived by the 8:47 train purely for the fishing. Sir Henry's fishing always coincided with murder. Over 2 half-pints of mild and bitter, Miss Marple laid out her findings. Someone entered after closing, Henry. Someone Gladys trusted enough to let in at 11 o'clock at night. Someone who brought a rose already prepared. Sir Henry twirled his mustache. Nicotine? Very probably. Distilled tobacco juice injected into the stem. 1 prick behind the ear. Heart stops within minutes. No fuss, no noise. Perfect for a village. And the letters? Gladys had been holding 4 that could ruin people. I believe the murderer took them, but photographs may have been made first. Sir Henry drained his glass. Blackmail on blackmail. Delightful. Shall we visit the suspects? Their first call was the Red House. Lavinia Gray received them in a drawing room that looked like a stage set for Noel Coward. White carpet, black lacquer, one enormous mirror reflecting a dozen crimson roses in a silver bowl. Darlings? How perfectly thrilling, a real detective. She waved a cigarette holder like a conductor's baton. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the roses. Every stem had been pierced near the base with a needle-fine hole. Green sap wept gently. Miss Gray, your roses are magnificent, she said. Do you treat them with anything special? Only love, Lavinia trilled. And a secret mixture my gardener swears by. Tobacco water, darling. Kills greenfly stone dead. She laughed, but the laugh did not quite reach her eyes. Sir Henry asked smoothly, Were you here all Tuesday evening? Rehearsing lines for the Women's Institute 1-act play. Alone, I'm afraid. No alibi worth a damn. She shrugged theatrically. As they left, Miss Marple paused in the hall. On the console table lay a small parcel in brown paper addressed in violet ink. Postmarked Tunbridge Wells. Unopened. Next, Mr. Ambrose Luce's cottage opposite the church. Tiny, immaculate, smelling of brasso and sanctity. The harmonium occupied one entire wall. Photographs of past choir boys lined another. Mr. Luce offered Madeira and stale Bath Olivers. His hands trembled as he poured. I was practicing the Bach toccata all evening, he said. Mrs. Dane in the cottage next door complained about the noise until 10 o'clock. Miss Marple noticed a developing tray on the sideboard, still wet. Beside it, a packet of Ilford gaslight paper and a red safe light bulb. Such a tragic loss, Mr. Luce murmured. Gladys sang contralto in the choir for 30 years. Her "O Rest in the Lord" brought tears to the eyes. He indicated a framed photograph. Gladys in 1923, stiff collarette, eyes bright as a bird's. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window. From here one looked directly across the lane into the post office sorting room. The angle was perfect. At 11 o'clock they found Ruth Price cycling between visits, cheeks whipped pink by the wind. She dismounted shakily when Sir Henry introduced himself. "Please, sir, I never touched the morphine. It was only 2 ampules for my mother's pain." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her arm. "My dear, no one is accusing you." "Yet." Ruth's eyes filled. "Gladys said she'd give the letter to matron unless Tom paid her £20. We haven't 20 shillings. Sir Henry asked quietly. "Where were you Tuesday night?" "At the pictures in Much Benham with Tom. The Palace. Roman holiday. We caught the 6:30 bus home, got off at the crossroads at 10:20. Tom walked me to my door, then went on to the sorting office to collect the late mail bag. He was there till midnight." Miss Marple made a small, satisfied sound. Alibis were beginning to form like crystals in a chemistry set. They lunched at Gossington Hall with the Bantrys. Dolly Bantry, still furious about the Maltese casino revelation, served cold ham and fury in equal measure. Colonel Bantry blustered, "If I'd murdered the woman, I'd have used a kukri, not a damned flower." Miss Marple buttered a scone. "Colonel, when did you last visit the post office?" "Monday morning, paid a bill." Gladys smirked, knew I was overdrawn again. "Infernal cheek." Dolly fixed him with a gimlet eye. "You gave her £50 on the 1st of every month, Arthur. Don't deny it." The colonel choked on his chutney. At 2 o'clock, Inspector Slack arrived from Much Benham. Tall, ginger, convinced that all villagers were half-wits and that spinsters were the worst. He listened to Miss Marple's findings with the expression of a man sucking a lemon. "Elderly ladies imagining things," he muttered to Sir Henry. Sir Henry merely smiled. By 3 o'clock, Miss Marple was back in the sealed post office, this time with official permission. She examined the stamp album on the shelf. Page 47 was blank where the 1948 Malaya Tiger 8 Seals should have been. Gladys had shown it to her only last month, gloating gently. On the floor beneath the album she found another flake of gold leaf and caught on a nail. A single strand of ash-blonde hair. She placed both in separate envelopes. At 4:30 she stood in the tiny post office garden. The Michaelmas daisies were battered flat where someone had knelt. The soil was still damp. She scraped a sample into a pillbox. Then she looked up at Mr. Luce's cottage. The bedroom curtain twitched. On her way home she called at the chemist's. Mr. Blend, round and anxious, confirmed that nicotine insecticide had been sold to 3 people this summer. Chapter 4. The Garden Party. Red Herring Friday, the 31st of October, broke clear and sharp, the sort of autumn day that makes one forgive England for the other 364. Sunlight poured over St. Mary Mead like warm syrup, turning every spider's web into a jewel and every fallen leaf into a guinea. At 11 o'clock precisely, the gates of the Red House stood open, flanked by 2 clipped bay trees wearing scarlet ribbons like chorus girls. A chalkboard on an easel announced in Lavinia Gray's flamboyant copperplate, "Garden Party," in memory of our dear postmistress Gladys Stubbs. Donations to the District Nurse Fund straw boaters felt cloches, one daring young matron in a turquoise turban that looked as though it had escaped from a cruise brochure. Tables draped in damask groaned beneath cucumber sandwiches cut so thin they were almost transparent, scones still steaming, and 3 Victoria sponges that Mrs. Clement had baked at dawn while praying for deliverance. Miss Marple arrived at 2:28 wearing her mulberry coat and the expression of a cat who knows exactly where the cream is hidden. She carried a small rush basket containing a jar of blackberry jelly for the raffle, and tucked beneath her handkerchief the envelopes of evidence now labeled in her neat violet ink. Sir Henry Clithering, magnificent in tweed +4s, offered his arm. "Ready for the circus, Jane?" "Ready," she murmured, "to watch the clowns juggle their alibis." Lavinia Gray held court beside the rose walk, dressed in a gown of hyacinth blue silk that must have cost the earth and looked as though it had been poured over her. She was laughing at something Colonel Bantry had said, one gloved hand resting on his sleeve with the ease of long practice. The rose walk itself was the wonder of the afternoon. Every bush had been stripped bare on Tuesday night. Now, miraculously, it blazed with fresh blooms, dozens of crimson glory roses, each more perfect than the last, wired onto the naked stems with florists' silver twine. The effect was theatrical, almost indecent. Miss Marple paused to inhale. The scent was heavy, almost cloying, and beneath it lay the sharp, unmistakable tang of nicotine. A string quartet from the Much Benham Ladies' College played Elgar beneath the cedar tree. Mr. Ambrose Luce, in a dove-gray morning coat that strained across his shoulders, stood ready to turn pages. Every time Lavinia moved, his eyes followed her like a dog watching a bone. Ruth Price and Tom Bragg circulated with collection boxes, both looking as though they had slept badly for a week. Ruth's left hand kept straying to her throat, where a small sticking plaster hid the scratch from Tuesday's thorn. At 3 o'clock, Lavinia clapped her hands theatrically. "Darlings, a surprise!" From the summer house emerged Clara the maid and Mrs. Dane's nephew Billy, carrying between them an enormous silver cup filled to the brim with crimson roses. A white card tied with satin ribbon read, "To Gladys, who kept our secrets, now yours are safe forever, Saint Mary Mead." The crowd murmured approval. Colonel Bantry blew his nose like a trumpet. Miss Marple's lips tightened. Safe forever was an ambiguous phrase. Tea was poured. Conversation rose and fell like a tide. Colonel Bantry cornered Sir Henry beside the rockery. "See here, Clithering, old man, that rose business pure flummery. If I'd wanted Gladys dead, I'd have used a Webley, not a blasted flower." "Yet you bought nicotine from Blends in August," Sir Henry said mildly. The colonel turned puce. "For the delphinium, swear on my oath." Mr. Percival Fortescue drifted past, clutching a plate of eclairs in anxiety. He drew Miss Marple behind the laurel. "The Tunbridge Wells parcel has vanished," he hissed. "Contained bearer bonds worth £5,000. Mrs. Arabella Stubbs is threatening to sue the Postmaster General." Miss Marple patted his arm. "Dear Mr. Fortescue, parcels have a habit of turning up in the oddest places, like conscience." At 3:30, the sun slipped behind a cloud and the temperature dropped like a stone. Lavinia announced games. First, a treasure hunt, clues hidden among the roses. Miss Marple watched the village scatter like chickens. She herself remained seated, knitting something lavender that was beginning to look suspiciously like a noose. Ruth Price found the first clue, a scroll tied with crimson ribbon tucked into the birdbath. She read aloud in a trembling voice, "I bloom in darkness, I prick the heart, my secret kills, yet leaves no mark." The crowd laughed nervously. Miss Marple did not laugh. 10 minutes later, young Billy Dane discovered the second clue inside the hollow sundial. This one was written on heavy cream paper watermarked with a crest, a stag rampant. Lavinia's personal stationery. "Follow the path where the organist plays, the shadow falls at the end of the day." Mr. Luce went white to the gills. Chapter 5. The Midnight Visitor. The village slept beneath a frost so hard that every blade of grass looked as though it had been dipped in powdered glass. Only 2 windows in St. Mary Mead still glowed, the lamp over the lich gate of the church, and the small fanlight above Miss Marple's front door. She had not gone to bed. At 11:43, she sat in her darkened sitting room in her dressing gown the color of winter violets, hair in 2 neat plaits. knitting needles silent for once. On the table before her lay the poisoned rose wrapped in damp cotton wool, the empty nicotine bottle, and a single sheet of her best vellum notepaper on which she had written in violet ink, "The murderer will return tonight." They always do. Gladys still has something they need. Across the green, the post office stood black and blind, yet Miss Marple's eyes never left its side gate. She had asked Constable Polk to leave the seal on the front door intact, but to oil the latch on the back. Polk had grumbled, but Sir Henry had smiled, and the latch now opened without a sound. At 11:58, the church clock began to strike 12. On the fourth stroke, a figure appeared at the corner of the lane. Tall, hooded, moving with the silent purpose of someone who has rehearsed this journey in dreams. A dark lantern, shuttered to a blade of light, swung at knee-height. Miss Marple did not move. She simply watched as the figure slipped through the side gate and vanished behind the post office wall. Inside her cottage, the grandfather clock ticked like a slow heart. 1 minute. Then a faint scraping sound, the soft clink of metal on wood, and the narrow beam of the lantern flickered across the sorting room window. Miss Marple rose, wrapped her paisley shawl closer, and opened her front door a careful inch. The frost bit her cheeks. She stepped onto the path in her felt slippers and closed the door behind her without a click. The village green lay silver under the moon, her breath plumed white. She moved along the hedge like a small, determined ghost until she reached the post office garden wall. From here, she could see everything. The hooded figure knelt beneath the sorting room window. A gloved hand, left hand, worked quickly with a jemmy no longer than a lady's fan. The sash lifted with the sigh of dry wood. The figure hoisted itself inside with surprising strength, lantern first, then shoulders. Then the swirl of a dark cloak. Miss Marple waited. She had learned long ago that patience is the detective's sharpest weapon. 3 minutes and 40 seconds later, the figure reappeared, this time carrying a small bundle wrapped in what looked like oilskin. The lantern was extinguished. Moonlight glinted on something metallic in the right hand. A pair of left-handed secateurs. The intruder paused, listening. Somewhere a fox barked. Then the figure turned, and for one heartbeat, the hood slipped back. Moonlight fell full on ash-blonde hair pinned in victory rolls. Lavinia Gray. Miss Marple pressed herself into the shadow of the rambling rector rose. Thorns caught at her shawl. She did not flinch. Lavinia moved fast now along the wall, past the coal shed and out through the side gate. Instead of returning up the lane, she cut across the green toward the churchyard, keeping to the deeper shadows beneath the yews. Miss Marple followed at 20 paces, slippers silent on the frost. The lich gate creaked. Lavinia passed beneath it and disappeared among the tombstones. Miss Marple counted to 10, then followed. The churchyard smelled of wet stone and chrysanthemums left too long in jam jars. Ahead, a match flared, brief orange, revealing Lavinia's face for a second. Beautiful, terrified, determined. She knelt beside a freshly dug grave, Gladys's own plot, prepared yesterday by Mr. Mullins the sexton. Lavinia worked quickly. She scraped away a layer of frozen earth with the secateurs, laid the oilskin bundle in the hollow and covered it again. Then she pressed a single crimson rose, taken from her pocket, into the soil like a seal. She stood, brushed her gloves together, and whispered something Miss Marple could not catch. Miss Marple stepped forward. The frost crunched beneath her slipper. Lavinia spun round, eyes wide. For a moment, the two women stared at each other across the grave of the woman one had murdered and the other had failed to save. "Miss Marple," Lavinia said at last. Her voice was steady, almost amused. How terribly predictable. Miss Marple's voice was softer than the frost. My dear, you have just buried the bearer bonds, I imagine. And perhaps the original letters, but you have forgotten something. Lavinia lifted her chin. Have I? You left your secateurs on the sorting table. Left-handed, silver, monogrammed LG. The ones you used to cut every bloom from your prize bush on Tuesday night. Constable Polk will find them at dawn. For the first time, Lavinia's composure cracked. You can't prove... I don't need to, said Miss Marple gently. You have just done it for me. She reached into her dressing gown pocket and produced a small silver whistle. Her nephew Raymond's old Boy Scout relic. She blew one short, shrill blast. Chapter 6. The organist's secret Saturday, 7:30 in the morning. The frost still held the village in white silence. Miss Marple, dressed in her navy Sunday costume and the determined expression she usually reserved for whist drives, stood at Mr. Ambrose Luce's front gate with Sir Henry Clithering and a yawning Inspector Slack. She carried no handbag, only a small leather hymn book and the look of someone who has not slept but has decided everything. Mr. Luce opened the door in his dressing gown, hair on end, eyes red-rimmed. The smell of photographic developer drifted out like incense gone wrong. Miss Marple, at this hour? We have come for matins, Mr. Luce, she said pleasantly, and for the truth. They stepped into the narrow hall. On the hat stand hung the hooded cassock the village had seen only at Christmas midnight mass. One sleeve was torn. A thread of crimson wool caught the light, exactly the shade of crimson glory petals. Inspector Slack's eyebrows rose like rockets. The sitting room was chaos. Every surface held trays of fixing solution, glass plates, packets of Ilford paper. On the harmonium lay a stack of freshly printed photographs, still damp. Colonel Bantry signing a check for $50 dated 1st October. Ruth Price pocketing morphine ampules in the surgery dispensary. Lavinia Gray accepting a thick envelope from a man in a naval greatcoat, 1919, and most damning, Lavinia herself on Tuesday night, hooded, lifting the post office sash. Mr. Luce made a small sound like a dying mouse. Miss Marple picked up the top print with stamp tongs. You photographed the letters through the post office window weeks ago, she said. Every Tuesday and Thursday when Gladys worked late under the gas mantle. A telephoto lens on your Leica, quite professional. Then you waited. She turned to the harmonium. Beneath the music rest lay the missing 1948 Malaya Tiger 8C stamp, carefully hinged onto a blank page ready for forgery. 00 to 0240 Slack found his voice. You blackmailed the blackmailer. Mr. Luce sank onto the piano stool. She was going to sell the negatives to a London dealer for £2,000. I offered $3, if she gave me the originals first. She laughed, said she'd bury me with my own secrets. His hands shook. So I followed her. After she left the post office at 12:05. I saw her bury the bundle in the grave. I waited until the police car took her away, then I dug it up myself. He opened a hymn book. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, were the 5 bearer bonds and the 3 lavender envelopes. Miss Marple's voice was softer than forgiveness. You wore the cassock so that if anyone saw a figure in the churchyard, they would think it was the verger locking up. You used the harmonium bellows to fan the developer fumes out of the window, so no one would smell the chemicals. And you left 1 flake of gold leaf in the post office because your makeup box, bought for the St. Jude's Passion Play, spills whenever you hurry. She laid the 2 flakes of gold leaf side by side on the blotter. They matched perfectly. Mr. Luce began to cry, quiet, tidy tears that ran into his collar. I only wanted the photograph of Gladys and me. The one Ruth Price took yesterday. I was 22. She was 19. We were going to be married. Then the child came and her father sent her away. I never even saw my son. He looked up, eyes raw. I didn't kill her. I swear on the 39 articles I didn't kill her. Miss Marple believed him. She had seen murderers before. They carried a different darkness. Inspector Slack snapped handcuffs anyway. Conspiracy, theft, receiving stolen goods, plenty to keep you until the assizes. As they let him out, Mr. Luce paused at the harmonium. He pressed middle C. The note hung in the cold air like a question. Will you tell the choir I shan't be at practice? Miss Marple closed the fall board gently. I shall tell them you have been called to a higher service. In the lane, the frost was beginning to lift. Church bells began to ring for early service. Clear, forgiving English. Sir Henry offered Miss Marple his arm. 2 murderers, Jane. Lavinia for the poison, Luce for the photographs. A duet in D minor. She leaned on him lightly. Gladys conducted the orchestra, Henry. She simply forgot that every player eventually wants a solo. They walked toward the lich gate. Behind them, Constable Polk locked the cottage door and pocketed the key with the satisfied air of a man who has finally understood the sermon. At the grave, fresh earth had been replaced and turfed over. A single crimson rose, now frost-bitten and drooping, lay where Lavinia had pressed it into the soil 12 hours earlier. Miss Marple picked it up, thorns and all. She tucked it between the pages of her hymn book like a pressed flower from a wedding that never happened. Poor Gladys, she said. She kept everyone's secret so long she forgot they could keep her. The bells reached the end of their changes and settled into the familiar call to prayer. Miss Marple opened the hymn book, found the place, and began to walk toward the church. Behind her, the village woke to another ordinary Saturday. Ordinary, that is, until the next secret decided to bloom. Chapter 7. The postman's confession. The village awoke to the smell of wood smoke and remorse. 2 patrol cars sat outside the police station like black beetles, and every curtain in St. Mary Mead twitched in perfect unison. At 9 o'clock sharp, Miss Marple took her usual seat in the little room behind the post office that now served as temporary incident room. Inspector Slack had spread photographs across the sorting table like a grim game of patience. Sir Henry leaned against the counter, pipe glowing. Constable Polk stood to attention with his notebook open at a fresh page and his ears pink. The door opened. Tom Bragg stepped in, cap in hand, shoulders filling the frame. Ruth Price clung to his arm, eyes swollen, engagement ring glinting like a tiny handcuff. Slack wasted no time. Thomas Bragg, I am arresting you for the murder of Gladys Stubbs on the night of 28th October. Tom's knees buckled. Ruth gave a small animal cry. Miss Marple raised one finger. Inspector, before you finish that sentence, may I have 2 minutes? Slack scowled, but the finger stayed up until he nodded. Miss Marple turned to the postman. Tom, look at me. He did. Honest brown eyes, bloodshot but steady. Tell us exactly what happened on Tuesday night. Every step. Leave nothing out. Tom swallowed. I finished the London collection at the station at 5 to 12. Mr. Hurst, the station master, signed the book here. He laid the post office ledger on the table, finger on the entry time 23:54. Then I walked Ruth home. Left her at her gate at 12:05. Came straight here to drop the late mailbag. He pointed to the clock on the wall. Gladys was still alive, sitting right there, sorting the American parcels. She gave me a cup of tea, 2 sugars, she remembered. We talked about the wedding. She said she'd knock 10 pounds off the price of the letters if we invited her to the reception. His voice cracked. I told her we couldn't pay. She laughed, said there were other ways. Then she showed me the drawer, my drawer, full of photographs. Me and Ruth outside the surgery, clear as day. Ruth began to cry silently. Tom went on, slower now. I lost my temper, shouted that she was a wicked old woman. She just smiled and said, Mind your tongue, Tommy Bragg, or I'll mind it for you. I stormed out, left the mailbag on the floor and the door on the latch. That was 12:22. I remember because the church clock struck the quarter as I crossed the green. He looked at Slack. I never touched her, sir. I swear on my mother's grave. Miss Marple opened her hymn book, the one that now held the frost-bitten rose, and took out a single sheet of paper. She laid it beside the ledger. Tom's handwriting, she said quietly. And here is the note slipped under my door at 25 minutes past 12 on Tuesday night. The note read, Miss M., if anything happens to Gladys, tell them Tom Bragg was here till 12:30. He's a good lad. G.S. Gladys's copperplate, unmistakable. Slack stared as though someone had hit him with a sandbag. Miss Marple continued. Gladys wrote that after Tom left. She knew she was in danger. She wanted to protect him because, well, because she had watched him grow up. Village postmistresses are like that. They terrorize us, but they love us too. She turned the frost-bitten rose in her fingers. This bloom was cut at 12:28. The stem is still bleeding sap. See the green stain? Lavinia entered less than 6 minutes after Tom stormed out. Gladys let her in because they had an appointment about the bearer bonds. Lavinia carried 12 prepared roses in a florist's box. She only needed one. Sir Henry tapped ash into the wastepaper basket. Time of death fixed by the station master's signature, the church clock, and Gladys's own note. Poor Bragg was 3 streets away when the nicotine entered her bloodstream. Slack closed his notebook with a snap that sounded like surrender. Charges withdrawn, he muttered. But I'll have you for leaving the door on the latch, lad. Tom managed a watery grin. Worth it, sir. Ruth flung her arms round Miss Marple. We can get married now. Laburnum Cottage, deposit paid yesterday. Miss Marple patted her back. Invite Gladys to the wedding anyway, my dear. Leave a chair empty at the back. She would like that. Outside, the sun had climbed high enough to melt the frost on the post office window. For the first time in a week, light fell across the sorting table, picking out the faint outline where Gladys had fallen. Tom picked up his cap. I'll finish the round then. Mail must go through. He paused at the door. Miss Marple, will you walk with me to the church? Ruth wants to put flowers on the grave. Proper ones this time. Miss Marple took his arm. I should like that very much. As they stepped into the lane, the village seemed to breathe again. Doors opened, curtains stopped twitching. Old Mrs. Harmon waved from her gate with a slice of seed cake. The 3 of them walked slowly toward the lich gate, the postman, the nurse, and the gentle lady who had given them back their future. Behind them, the post office door stood open for the first time in 10 days, letting sunlight flood every corner. Chapter 8. The Rose That Killed. A pale, reluctant sun climbed over the roofs of St. Mary Mead, as though it too dreaded what the day must reveal. At 10 o'clock precisely, Dr. Haydock's surgery waiting room had been cleared of patients. The blinds were drawn, the door locked, and a notice read, "Closed until further notice." Inside on the examination couch lay one perfect crimson glory rose wrapped in cotton wool. Miss Marple's gift from the garden party kept damp in her refrigerator for 3 days. Around it stood the final circle: Miss Marple, Sir Henry Clithering, Inspector Slack, trying not to look impressed, Dr. Haydock in his white coat, and Mr. Blend the chemist clutching a small brown bottle like a man holding a live grenade. Haydock lifted the rose with forceps. Stem injected 1 centimeter below the calyx. Needle mark barely visible. Classic technique, used in the war for assassinating spies behind the lines. He slit the stem lengthwise. Clear, viscous liquid oozed onto the porcelain dish. Blend adjusted his spectacles. Pure nicotine, distilled from pipe tobacco in a simple still. 1 milliliter is enough to kill an ox. This rose held 3. Slack whistled. So the old girl was dead before she hit the table. Haydock nodded. Cardiac arrest within 90 seconds, no struggle, no cry. She simply folded forward, postcard still in her hand. Miss Marple opened her Morocco notebook to the page headed Weapon. She read aloud, softly, as though reciting a prayer. 12 roses prepared Sunday, 26th of October. Lavinia's diary, seized yesterday. 6 bottles nicotine purchased August-September. Empty bottle found buried under rose walk. Left-handed secateurs recovered from sorting table. Single thorn scratch on Lavinia's left palm, matches length of stem. Green sap on Gladys's cardigan, buttonhole, still fresh at 6:15 a.m. She closed the book. Everything fits, Inspector, like a glove. Slack rubbed his chin. But why the rose at all? Why not a syringe straight to the neck? Miss Marple's eyes were very blue and very bright. Because, Inspector, Lavinia Gray is an actress. Every murder must have a signature. A plain hypodermic is vulgar. A crimson rose pinned to the heart. That is theater. She wanted Gladys to know exactly who had paid her back, and she wanted the village to remember the performance forever. Sir Henry tapped ash into Haydock's kidney dish. And the postcard? Tonight the rose will tell? Gladys wrote it herself, Miss Marple said. She had agreed to meet Lavinia at 11:30 to hand over the bearer bonds. She suspected danger, but pride would not let her refuse. The postcard was her insurance. If she died, we would know the rose was the weapon. She laid the frost-bitten graveyard rose beside the fresh one. 2 roses, same bush, same poison. One killed, one confessed. Dr. Haydock lifted the poisoned stem to the light. I'll sign the certificate. Death by nicotine poisoning administered maliciously by person or persons unknown. Though we all know the person. Slack closed his notebook with finality. Lavinia Gray will hang before the spring bulbs are out. Miss Marple looked suddenly tired. She will hang, yes. But Gladys helped dig the scaffold. 33 years of opening letters, storing secrets, selling them back at compound interest. In the end, she sold her own life for £5,000 and a handful of photographs. She gathered her gloves. Evil is not a visitor in St. Mary Mead, Inspector. It is a tenant. We simply choose which rooms to let it. Outside, the village was holding its breath again. Children walked to school in unnatural silence. The butcher had not put out his usual cheerful greeting. Even the sparrows seemed subdued. Miss Marple paused at the surgery gate. One last thing, Doctor. The post-mortem, did you find any trace of digitalis? Haydock frowned. Funny you should ask. There was a trace, therapeutic dose. She had been taking it for months. I prescribed it myself. Miss Marple nodded, unsurprised. Then Gladys knew her heart was failing. She simply chose to go out with a flourish rather than fade in a nursing home. She walked slowly home past the sealed post office. A small queue had already formed, people waiting for their pensions, their parcels, their ordinary lives to resume. At her gate, she met Ruth Price cycling to the surgery, cheeks pink with happiness. Morning, Miss Marple. Tom starts the new round tomorrow. They've given him Gladys's old bicycle, said it's only right. Miss Marple smiled. Gladys would approve. She always believed the mail must go through, especially when it carries wedding invitations. Inside her cottage, the fire was laid but not lit. She set the 2 roses, killer and confessor, side by side in a Wedgwood vase, then opened her notebook to the final page. She wrote in violet ink, Case closed. Motive, greed masked as pride. Method, a flower. Lesson, secrets are like roses, beautiful until they prick the hand that holds them too long. She underlined the last sentence, closed the book, and placed it on the shelf between the murder at the vicarage and the St. Mary Mead Parish Magazine, 1932-1947. Outside, the sun strengthened. A blackbird began to sing from the vicarage chimney. Somewhere a kettle whistled for 11 o'clock tea. Life, as Miss Marple had always known, would go on, with or without its secrets. Chapter 9. The Drawing Room. Denouement. Gossington Hall drawing room, fire crackling, curtains drawn against the early dark. 14 people sat in a half-circle that looked suspiciously like a dock. Colonel Bantry presided at the tea table, mustache bristling with importance. Dolly Bantry poured lapsang souchong as though it were communion wine. Inspector Slack stood by the door, arms folded, trying to look ornamental. Sir Henry Clithering lounged against the mantelpiece, pipe glowing like a small red planet. Miss Marple occupied the small gilt chair usually reserved for the bishop. She wore her dove-gray afternoon dress and the faint smile of someone who has finished the crossword and is waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. Lavinia Gray sat between two constables, wrists free but face pale beneath the perfect makeup. She wore the same hyacinth blue gown from the garden party, now creased and smelling faintly of cells. Mr. Ambrose Luce, handcuffed to a burly sergeant, stared at the carpet as though it might open and swallow him. The others, Ruth and Tom, Mr. Fortescue, Dr. Haydock, even Clara the maid, waited in the hush that falls when truth is about to be born in public. Miss Marple set down her cup. The chink of porcelain on saucer sounded like a gavel. "Shall we begin?" she asked pleasantly. She rose, small and straight as a candle. Gladys Stubbs died because she believed secrets were currency. She spent 33 years collecting them, and on the night of 28th October she tried to spend the largest amount she had ever held, 5 bearer bonds and 4 reputations. She turned to Lavinia. "You, Miss Gray, paid £50 a month for 3 years to keep your husband's true will secret. When Gladys demanded half the bonds outright, you decided the price had become too high. You distilled nicotine, injected 12 perfect roses, and at 12:28 you pricked Gladys behind the left ear with this one." She held up the cotton-wrapped rose from the surgery. The room drew a collective breath. Lavinia lifted her chin. "Prove it." Miss Marple smiled. "Gladys proved it for me. The postcard, 'Tonight the Rose Will Tell,' was written after Tom Bragg left at 12:22. Your secateurs, left-handed, monogrammed, were found on the sorting table. The empty nicotine bottle under your rose walk, the thorn scratch on your left palm, the green sap on Gladys's cardigan. And finally," she produced the frost-bitten rose from the churchyard grave. "This one, planted by you at 2 o'clock Saturday morning over the bonds you intended to retrieve at dawn. You buried your crime and your profit in the same hole." Lavinia's composure cracked like thin ice. "She was a monster," the words burst out. "She laughed when I begged, said actresses were replaceable but blackmailers were artists." Miss Marple turned to Mr. Luce. "And you, Mr. Luce, photographed every incriminating letter through the post office window for months. You waited until Lavinia had done the deed, then crept in after her, took the bonds and the originals, and printed your own set of photographs to sell in London. You left gold leaf from your passion play makeup box and a thread from your cassock sleeve. Small mistakes, but murder is always untidy at the edges." Mr. Luce began to weep again, silently. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat like a starting gun. "Here, I say, this is all very well, but what about my £50 a month?" Dolly fixed him with a stare that could have frozen brandy. "You will get it back from the police, Arthur. Every penny. And then you will hand it to me." The colonel subsided. Miss Marple resumed her seat. Gladys kept 4 secrets that night. Colonel Bantry's gambling debts, Ruth's morphine, Lavinia's inheritance, Mr. Luce's lost son. She sold them all and she died for it. But she left us the clues in plain sight. The rose, the postcard, the open drawer, the untouched mailbags. She wanted us to understand. She looked round the room gently. We are none of us innocent. We wrote the letters, we paid the money, we looked away. Gladys merely held the mirror. Silence, thick as dust. Then Lavinia laughed, low, bitter, final. Bravo, Miss Marple. You should have been on the stage. Miss Marple inclined her head. I prefer the audience, my dear. One sees so much more clearly from the stalls. Inspector Slack stepped forward. Lavinia Gray, I charge you with the murder of Gladys Stubbs. Ambrose Luce, I charge you with theft and receiving stolen goods. He paused almost gently. Anything to say? Lavinia stood. The hyacinth silk caught the firelight like water. She looked once at Miss Marple, once at the rose on the table. Tell them, she said clearly, that the rose was perfect, and so was I. She walked out between the constables without looking back. Mr. Luce followed, head bowed, harmonium notes still echoing in his ears. The fire settled in the grate. Outside, rooks wheeled over the bare trees. Miss Marple lifted her cup, found it cold, and set it down again. Dolly Bantry whispered, Jane, was she right? Are we all guilty? Miss Marple considered. We are all human, Dolly. That is quite bad enough. She rose, smoothed her skirt, and smiled at the room. Now, who would like a slice of cherry cake? Murder is hungry work. Chapter 10. Morning tea and marmalade, Guy Fawkes morning, and St. Mary Mead smelled of bonfires and second chances. At 10:30, Miss Marple's cottage was warm with the scent of toasted crumpets, Cooper's Oxford marmalade, and the particular hush that follows a storm. The gate clicked. Dolly Bantry arrived first, mink coat over arm, cheeks pink from the cold. Colonel Bantry followed, carrying a brown paper parcel tied with string from the bank. Ruth and Tom Bragg came hand in hand, Ruth's left glove hiding a brand-new wedding ring that had cost exactly £43 10 shillings, Gladys's last gift, returned by the Crown. Sir Henry Clithering brought up the rear, pipe glowing like a small satisfied dragon. Miss Marple had set the table with her best spode, pink roses, hairline crack in one saucer nobody ever mentioned, and a Victoria sponge so light it threatened to float. She greeted them at the door in her mulberry wool and the tiny smile she kept for happy endings. Do come in. The kettle sang 5 minutes ago and Cherry has just taken the scones out. They gathered round the fire. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat 3 times before managing speech. Jane, dash it all. On behalf of the village, grateful. Stammer, Dolly cut him off. What Arthur means is thank you for saving us from ourselves. She laid the brown paper parcel on the table. £40,000, every penny accounted for. The bank manager wept, actually wept, when we paid off the overdraft. Ruth stepped forward, eyes shining. Tom and I want you to have this. She placed a small blue box beside the marmalade. Inside, a delicate silver brooch shaped like a rose, thorns and all. The jeweler in Much Benham made it from Gladys's mother-of-pearl pin, the one you found under the U. We thought, well, she would like you to wear it. Miss Marple pinned it to her cardigan at once. The pearl caught the firelight and threw back a tiny rainbow. Sir Henry raised his cup. To Jane Marple, terror of the guilty, comfort of the innocent, and the best detective Scotland Yard never paid. They drank. Even Inspector Slack, lurking in the doorway with his helmet under his arm, lifted an imaginary cup. Dolly leaned forward. But Jane, tell us properly. How did you know it was the rose? Miss Marple buttered a scone with the precision of a surgeon. My dear, when I was 12, I helped my uncle distill tobacco juice to kill wasps in the greenhouse. 1 drop on a thorn, 1 prick. Dead in seconds. Human hearts are only slightly larger wasps. She passed the scones. Gladys's postcard told us what to look for. Lavinia's theatrical soul did the rest. Murderers always sign their work. Tom spoke for the first time, voice rough. Gladys left us a note in the post office. Bible. Said if anything happened to her, we were to have Laburnum Cottage rent-free for a year. Mrs. Rundle cried when she read it. Ruth laughed through tears. We're getting married on the 22nd. You will come, Miss Marple? Front pew. I shall bring the cake knife, Miss Marple promised. Colonel Bantry produced a bottle of 1928 port from his parcel. Thought we might wet the brooch, what? Sir Henry fetched glasses. The cork came out with a soft sigh, like the village itself exhaling. Outside, children dragged garden rubbish to the bonfire on the green. Sparks flew upward into the pale November sky. Someone had stuck a guy on top wearing a postmistress's navy cardigan, and a crimson paper rose. The flames took hold. The guy bowed once gracefully and was gone. Inside, Miss Marple raised her glass. To Gladys Stubbs, who kept our secrets and in the end gave us back our souls. They drank. Cherry brought in fresh tea. The conversation turned to ordinary miracles. Mr. Luce had confessed everything and would serve 2 years, then retire to a monastery in Sussex. Lavinia Gray had asked for a private cell with a window. She was writing her memoirs. The Rose Killer, naturally. The post office would reopen tomorrow with Miss Hartnell in charge. She's deaf in one ear, perfect qualification. At 11:30, they walked Miss Marple to the gate. The bonfire crackled, sending sparks like small red apologies into the air. Dolly hugged her. You will come to us for Christmas, Jane. No arguments. Miss Marple smiled over her shoulder. I shall bring my knitting. Someone will need scarves. They left her standing among the Michaelmas daisies, silver brooch gleaming, cheeks pink with cold and contentment. She watched them go. 4 friends who had entered her cottage carrying guilt and left carrying hope. Then she turned back to the warm house, closed the door, and spoke to the quiet room. Well, Gladys, we managed it between us. You pointed, I followed. Rather a good team, after all. She took the frost-bitten rose from the spode vase, laid it between the pages of her Bible at the verse, Forgive us our trespasses, and closed the book with gentle finality. Outside, the church clock struck 12. A new postman's whistle sounded on the green. Bright, cheerful, unafraid. Miss Marple drew the curtains, set the kettle on again, and began to count stitches for a very small booty. Somewhere in the village a baby was coming, and secrets like autumn leaves had been swept away by a good strong wind.